Hello again, good afternoon. So it's Monday, April the 6th, and I'm here in order to give you another video lecture on Foucault's History of Sexuality. Apologies that the lecture comes only in the afternoon. I was trying to get away with this. I spent the morning doing emails and thought that no one would notice if I post the lecture just in the afternoon. This, however, turned out not to be true. It is now 16:41, it says on my little computer clock, and I've already received an email from a student asking me if there is not going to be a Foucault lecture today. So, apologies about that. The lecture is a few hours late. All right, a quick remark before we delve into the material. Someone else asked me, emailed me with a question about essay deadlines. The philosophy department is going to post the deadlines for all the second year, and of course for those of you who are in this class, third year is more important. The philosophy department is going to post all the deadlines for second and third year essays on Moodle, well, either today, later, perhaps it is already there. Mrs. Gleason was going to do this. Either today or tomorrow. We have tried to stagger these deadlines, making as much room as possible between the deadlines for the individual modules, because we obviously know that you no longer have any examinations to sit, but rather that everything has switched to continuous assessment, which means that you need to be sure as students that the essays don't all come due on the same day or within 3 or 4 days. We've tried to aim for that. It was easier in third year than in second year. Because in second year there are more modules, but you're going to see this. We've there's no situation where several essays are going to be due on the same day, but everything is stretched out a little bit. Regarding the essay for this class, that is to say for Foucault, I'm going to post details shortly, not topics yet, but just details, word length and so on and so forth. As far as topics are concerned, I'm going to use the same procedure that I used for the Heidegger essay, namely, once I'm done with my video lectures, I'm going to ask you for input regarding topics that you might find that you would like to write on. Okay, so much for practical matters. Let's move on to the next part of the History of Sexuality, Volume 1. So today I would like to cover Part 3, entitled Scientia Sexualis, Part 3, which begins on page 53 and ends on page, just looking at it here, 73. If one wanted to summarize the content of this part, of these 20 pages or so, in just one word, that word would be confession. Of course, I'm going to go into this in more detail in just about a minute, but again, for this very, very quick summary, in this part of the work, Foucault is going to argue that the religious practice of confession took on a much wider significance in modernity, that confession lost its religious meaning. Now, it still has a religious meaning, but it acquired an additional non-religious meaning in modern society, such that, as Foucault says at one point here, man became a confessing animal. We approached our own selves in such a way that we came to be convinced that in order to be ourselves, in order to constitute ourselves as individuals and as subjects, it came to be important to confess, to tell other people who we are. And this in a more general sense, but this in particular in relation to sexuality. So again, the principal thesis of this part of the work is that what used to be a religious practice, that is to say what used to be exclusively a religious practice, in the last couple of 100 years, 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, became a much more widespread practice for the constitution of selves, for the constitution of subjectivity. Now, what exactly does this mean? Well, that's what we're going to try to find out as we read these 20 pages together now. So, let's begin at the beginning, page 53, first few lines. Foucault begins with a summary of the contents of the work so far. I suppose that the first 2 points will be granted me. I imagine that people will accept my saying that for 2 centuries now, so 2 centuries, what is he talking about really? 20th and 19th. As I already marked before, his dates keep shifting a little bit. So I imagine that people will accepting my saying that for 2 centuries now, the discourse on sex has been multiplied rather than rarefied. That was the subject matter of the chapter entitled The Incitement to Discourse. For 2 centuries now, the discourse on sex has been multiplied rather than rarefied, and that if it has carried with it taboos and prohibitions, it has also, in a more fundamental way, ensured the solidification and implantation of an entire sexual mosaic. So that was the last few words there were a summary of the chapter entitled The Perverse Implantation. So far in this book, Foucault has argued that the so-called repressive hypothesis, according to which in the last few centuries we have first seen a repression of sexuality and then a rejection of this repression in the reform movements of the 20th century, he's been arguing that this explanation is inaccurate, rather that there has been more of a continuity in the last few centuries in relation to sexuality, that this continuity has been characterized A, by this transformation of sex into discourse, proliferation of discourse, and B, by what he calls in the title of the second chapter of the previous part, he calls the perverse implantation. That is to say, the fact that particular sexualities have been implanted in the bodies of people. Okay. Now he moves on. He moves on to another dimension of these developments in relation to sexuality, and this additional dimension concerns the relationship between this exploding discourse of which he's been speaking, this multiplication of discourses regarding sexuality, the relationship of these exploding discourses to the question of truth and knowledge. What does all this have to do with truth and knowledge? Foucault wants to argue in this chapter, if you look at the first 2 or 3 pages or so of this part of the work, pages 53, 54, 55, Foucault wants to say that despite the fact that in the discursive explosion that he has previously diagnosed, there was a significant amount of prudishness, of evasion, when it really came to the heart of naming sexual phenomena. Nonetheless, behind these developments that he's been describing, incitement to discourse and the perverse implantation, behind that there has been ultimately an impulse, as he calls it on page 57, to tell the truth of sex. That is to say, there is, according to Foucault, a significant relationship between the developments he's been describing and a certain will to knowledge, a certain will to talk to the truth, to find out the truth about sexuality. And what he's going to discuss now in these pages that I'm in the process of explaining to you, is this relationship between sexuality and truth, between sexuality and knowledge. Okay? All right. So much for the first few pages of this part. Now I'm on page 57, where there's a clearly indicated break. You will notice that there is a little bit of a white space there. So we're continuing beneath this white space. Foucault here makes an interesting distinction between what he calls, well, it's not his term, between ars erotica and scientia sexualis. Ars erotica, Latin word, something like the erotic art, and scientia sexualis, science, knowledge regarding sex. He says there, bottom of page 57, that there are 2 ways in which societies, now he's talking in a kind of global perspective, 2 ways in which societies have traditionally is not the word, 2 ways in which societies have and continue to establish a relationship between sex and truth. Mostly societies in the Far East, but he also mentions Rome, mostly societies in the Far East, of which examples that he gives are China, Japan, India, Rome, and he says the Arabo-Muslim societies. That's not necessarily the Far East either. That could also be the Mediterranean and the Near East. But at any rate, in these societies, according to Foucault, the relationship between sex and truth has been one, has found its expression in an ars erotica. Now, what's this ars erotica? The ars erotica is instruction by a master, somebody who knows, well, how to, well, what actually does this person know? How to make the most of sex, how to derive the most pleasure from sex. This master tells his disciples, would it also be her disciples? Not sure now. Foucault doesn't discuss this in detail. At any rate, this master reveals to his disciples how to gain the most pleasure out of sex. Okay. Now one might think that this was a very superficial enterprise. Well, superficial in one sense. Get the most pleasure out of sex. Foucault, however, thinks that it goes a little bit deeper than that. So it's not simply about physical enjoyment. It is about physical enjoyment, but there's more. As he writes on page 58, what is this about, this ars erotica? Well, 58, first few lines there on this page. An absolute mastery of the body. So it's not only mastery of one part of the body, an absolute mastery of the body. So through mastery of this one particular sexual aspect of the body, reaching a mastery of the body as a whole. Now it goes even further. A singular bliss, obliviousness to time and limits, the elixir of life, the exile of death and its threats. So this ars erotica becomes almost a project of some type of salvation, salvation from death, the ability to escape from time and its limits. So this ars erotica becomes, well, almost a kind of mystical project, the way in which Foucault is describing it. Okay, so what's the approach? Again, a master conveys knowledge regarding how to best use one's sexual faculties in order to reach these, well, rather lofty goals. Okay, but then he says, okay, this has not been the approach in our Western societies. Our approach has been different. It has been scientia sexualis. It has been centered. So, how has the relationship between sexuality and truth, sexuality and knowledge be construed? Not in accordance with this ars erotica, but rather in accordance with scientia sexualis, knowledge regarding sex. Knowledge meaning it's more theoretical. It's not about implementing a kind of practical knowledge of the body, but it's more coming to a theoretical understanding of sexuality. And then he goes on, how is this theoretical knowledge regarding sexuality gained? How is it reached? Well, he says, through confession. That's where confession comes in. He moves on now, on pages 58 and following ones, discussing confession in the context that I just mentioned. 58, center of the page. Since the Middle Ages, Foucault writes, since the Middle Ages at least, Western societies have established the confession as one of the main rituals we rely on for the production of truth. So, since the Middle Ages, confession has played an important part in finding out the truth about ourselves and letting other people know that truth. Now you might ask, how else apart from confession? In other words, telling people who I am, what I'm up to, what my strengths are, what my weaknesses are. In some sense, all that is confession. How else could one establish the truth about oneself? Well, Foucault says that before the Middle Ages, one date he gives here is the Lateran Council of 1215. That's an important council of the Catholic Church, where a rule was made. The rule was that one had to make a confession to one's parish priest at least once a year. Okay, so 1215. Now, confession existed before that, but in different forms. Not this kind of confession. It's actually very, very interesting, the history of confession. In the early church, confession was in fact a public thing. One would go to the entire community and say embarrassing things. I mean, to everyone. In the open, one would say, well, I slept with my neighbor's wife or something like this. Can you imagine that? So it was public, but in the early church. So anyway, that was just a little digression. In 1215, the Lateran Council says confession at least once a year. to one's parish priest. So not just to someone, not just to a priest in another parish or to some monk, one's parish priest. So for Foucault, that is an important date, indicating that confession now, at this point, begins to be more central in Western society. But again, the question I have not answered now, before confession acquired a particular importance in talking about oneself and establishing the truth about oneself, how else was this done? Well, go to the bottom of 58. For a long time, Foucault says there, the individual was vouched for by the reference of others and the demonstration of his ties to the commonweal, parentheses, family, allegiance, protection. Then he was authenticated by the discourse of truth he was able or obliged to pronounce concerning himself. So that the last few words there indicate the shift. So before this shift towards confession as the privileged way to reveal the truth, to establish the truth about oneself, it was much more important, let's say in a juridical context, in a trial, that other people were able to vouch for me. Did this person commit the burglary? Well, I would bring up people and say, Philip Roseman cannot possibly, we've known him for 20 years, he cannot possibly be a burglar. I vouch for him that he cannot be this individual because I know him so well, that's just not in him to be committing burglary. You see? So that's the way in which truth was established about someone, through ties in the community. And there was one other way, certainly in pre-modern times, to establish truth, a very cruel way. But it wasn't seen as cruel. It was just, it was seen as one way of finding out truth. That was trial. So, did this individual commit the burglary? Well, let's just put him underwater for 5 minutes, and if he emerges alive, then God has assisted him, and this indicates that he's not the burglar. If he drowns, well, then he's the burglar. Now, in a modern perspective, we would probably laugh about this and say, oh my gosh, this is just terribly cruel. It says nothing about reveals no truth about whether this person actually stole anything or not. However, well, you know, different times, different practices, this was seen as one of the methods to establish the truth about an individual. So, you see, two methods. And as you can see, they're not confession. They come from outside the individual. Did person X do what he or she is accused of? Well, first of all, let's ask the community. He or she can't possibly have done it. We know this individual. But then also, let's subject the individual to trials. Well, sometimes really of a very brutal, torture-like nature. And if the individual survives the trial, then the individual is not, but again, you see, it's of a different nature than confession. And then, one would say that's then trials become, more centered on the individual and perhaps also more humane. So now, let's go to the 21st century. One of the primary ways to establish someone's guilt is, of course, there's always evidence and, DNA samples collected, blah, 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 certainly. But the, most prized, privileged evidence, let's say in a courtroom, would, of course, be a confession. This individual was, interrogated by the guards about this crime that was committed, and he or she said he or she did it. That would be seen as the strongest possible evidence, on the basis of which somebody could be convicted. Okay. So, this move occurs, and what's, of course, now important is, this move occurs not simply in the church. We talked about Foucault talks about the Lateran Council, which makes confession much more important in the church. Confession doesn't just become much more important in the church, it becomes also important in other parts of society. So, for example, in the courtroom. And not just, church, courtroom. Before I move on page 59, Foucault again summarizes what he wants to argue in a very pithy way. Did I say 59? Last third of the page. Western man has become a confessing animal. Of course, he alludes here to kind of standard definitions of what it means to be human. Man is a rational animal, man is a symbolic animal, etc. Foucault says, well, in modernity we've become a confessing animal. In the church, in a juridical context, and then the bottom of 59, top of page 60, he also talks about the realm of literature. making an interesting distinction here. In older literature, what does older mean? Well, certainly pre-modern, early medieval literature. This literature focused on depicting the accomplishments, the deeds, often the trials, of a heroic figure. Think in this context also of stories told by the Irish bards. So it would be about King such and such, who prevails against this other king in a bloody battle, etc. Or think of, in the Middle Ages there were these so-called Arthurian tales. Think also of tales involving St. George and the dragon, for the English. So St. George slays the dragon. So the stories were, again, these are trials, some kind of dragon attacks, or some foreign army attacks, and the king is able to repel the foreign army, which establishes the character of the king, which shows that this is a great king, who is wonderful in battle and is very just, etc., etc., etc. But in the later Middle Ages, in the modernity, of course, literature is now different. Certainly, what should I say, the leading genres of literature. Not sure these heroic tales have completely disappeared, in particular in movies. They continue to exist. See, interesting question. But in the main literary genre now that dominates the contemporary literature is really the novel. It's not heroic tales about trials, it's the novel. And what is a novel? Well, a novel is the exploration of the inner life of a protagonist or a couple of protagonists. What does, consider, since we're in Ireland, consider James Joyce's Ulysses. The story of one guy's life in Dublin in one day. In-depth exploration of what this individual is doing over the day, thinking, saying, etc., etc. So you see, it's very much in a confessional mode, rather than in the mode of establishing who a person is through these external deeds. Okay? All right. On page 60, Foucault introduces a term which within the Foucauldian thought, within Foucault's philosophy, is very important. It's the term of subjection. What he wants to say there is confession in modern times has become the primary technique for the subjection of individuals. Now, what does subjection mean? First, let's read, page 60. An immense labor to which the West has submitted generations in order to produce, while other forms of work ensured the accumulation of capital, man's subjection, their constitution as subjects in both senses of the word. So, subjection for Foucault means constitution as subject in both senses of the word. Well, what are the two senses of which he doesn't explain here? What are the two senses of the word? Well, you can speak of the subject of a sentence. The professor gave a video lecture. Well, what is the subject of that sentence? Well, the professor. The subject of the sentence is the one who acts, the agent, the one who is in charge, the one who is engaged in activity, etc., etc. That's the first meaning of subject. Subject is the one who is the subject of the action, meaning in charge of it, the agent. The second meaning of subject occurs in an English phrase or sentence like, she was subject to a great deal of pain. She was subject to, or she was subject to persecution, or she was subject to, to whatever. Subject to meaning suffering, passive. Assuming a passive role, right? So the word subject has these two senses. It has the sense of agency, but it's also associated with being subjected to influences that are outside of one's control. Now, and what it means to be a subject, an individual, a human being, Foucault is suggesting here, means these two things. Being, on the one hand, an agent, and on the other hand, being someone who is subject to processes. Now, according to Foucault, in modern times we become subjects in this double sense through confession. So confession assumes a central role in making us who we are. An interesting thesis, isn't it? Because again, you see what I said initially, Foucault is now certainly no longer talking about the role of confession, meaning going to one's priest to confess, in a dark corner of the church. He's not saying that is what makes modern man. He's saying that what used to be this exclusively religious practice has assumed a much wider significance in the way in which we, as modern and contemporary human beings, become subjects, become what we are. Okay. All right. Now, on pages 61 and 62, Foucault goes into an interesting description of the structure of confession. Structure? Yeah, structure is the right word. What is it really that's... what is it really that is involved, not in terms of the content of a confession, but in terms of the, well, yeah, structures. What's another word for structures? The different poles, perhaps one could say, poles that are involved in a confession. And he writes this. I'll read it to you, and then I'll try to explain what he says here. 61, 62. The confession is a ritual of discourse in which the speaking subject is also the subject of the statement. Already. The confession is a ritual of discourse in which the speaking subject is also the subject of the statement. So I speak about myself, okay? It is also a ritual that unfolds within a power relationship. So I don't just speak about myself, but in a power relationship, for one does not confess without the presence or virtual presence. Now that's very interesting, particularly the internet age. What does he mean there, virtual presence? Of a partner who is not simply the interlocutor in a confession, let's say in the religious setting. I'm not really having a conversation with the priest, but I talk about myself and my own faults, the priest being there. Of a partner who is not simply the interlocutor, but the authority who requires the confession, prescribes and appreciates it, and intervenes in order to judge, punish, forgive, console, and reconcile. Yeah, well, in the religious context, well, anyway. A ritual in which the truth is corroborated by the obstacles and resistances it has to surmount in order to be formulated. Now, that's of course true. So the validity or the strength, the value of a confession comes from one's ability to overcome this kind of natural inhibition not to reveal embarrassing stuff about oneself. Okay? And so the more I'm able to overcome this resistance, the more authentic, the more full the confession is. And finally, a ritual in which the expression alone, independently of its external consequences, produces intrinsic modifications in the person who articulates it. Okay? So the very fact of confession, of saying, I've done this horrible thing, produces a change in me. Now, in the religious sense, Foucault would not be right. Or perhaps he would. It's actually interesting, the theology of confession. But, now, normally in a confession there would be an absolution. So simply my saying stuff wouldn't lead... Though my saying stuff, for example, my saying stuff, I'm really sorry that I lied last week or something. Well, that does produce a change in me, doesn't it? In the sense that I recognize that what I did there last week is not who I want to be. I want to be someone else. And now I bring myself to say, well, really what I did there last week, that kind of, that was not really very, very good. That was not cool. You see, I distance myself from myself. I say, this is not who I want to be, and I hereby avow I distance myself from myself. Okay? In the presence of this authority. Now, of course, look, I'm speaking as though I'm only talking about a religious confession. Foucault's point here, of course, is wider. Namely, we become confessing animals, such that the major way for us to reveal the truth about ourselves is to say who we are, or what we don't want to be, what we think we are, what we think we're not, in the presence of some type of authority figure. Not to the priest, in the presence of an authority figure. Okay? One example here that immediately comes to mind, Foucault doesn't mention it, but one example that's very much, what should I say, relevant to contemporary society, the society in which we live, is the ritual of coming out. That is a confession. And it has, I think, you have to think about it for yourselves, because you are members of contemporary society. You know what I'm talking about. Ask yourself if in the ritual of coming out, what Foucault says here about the religious confession applies. I'm not sure it applies 100%, but it would largely apply. If someone comes out, that means, well, I'm letting everyone know now, not really a sin, a transgression, that could be, but I'm letting everyone know what deep down I think I am. Now, in the very nature of things, someone has to be there. Someone has to validate this. Then also, my overcoming, my inhibition is very, very important in this process. So the more I overcome, the better is the confession. And then, of course, it also produces changes within myself, just as Foucault says. I have to tell you that I am X. Well, that makes me X. Now I am officially X, okay? So, just to explain, this is what Foucault is talking about. And don't you think, it's a very suggestive question, isn't it? I mean, I certainly think that what he's saying here is very, very interesting, that what used to be this religious ritual has now expanded into other areas of society. We already said juridical. But now, of course, already with the coming out, we're talking about something that has to do with one's sexuality. That is, of course, what Foucault wants to talk about here, because that's what the book is entitled, The History of Sexuality. All right. Moving on. On page 63, Foucault describes the way in which confession spread, this practice, this structure that I just described for you. How confession spread from the confessional, from the religious practice, to other areas of society. And I'm simply going to read this paragraph to you, well, so as to allow us to hear Foucault's voice. We're reading Foucault, so to listen to him rather than my talking about him occasionally is not a bad thing. 63. The confession was, and still remains, the general standard governing the production of the true discourse on sex. Now, sex. It has undergone a considerable transformation, however. For a long time, it remained firmly entrenched in the practice of penance. But with the rise of Protestantism, the Counter-Reformation, 18th century pedagogy, and 19th century medicine, it gradually lost its ritualistic and exclusive localization. It spread. It has been employed in a whole series of relationships. Children and parents, students and educators, patients and psychiatrists, you know, the person seeking psychological counseling or psychoanalytic cure, going to the psychoanalyst or going to the psychiatrist, lying on a couch and confessing, telling this professional one's most intimate thoughts, one's dreams, one's fears, one's anxieties, etc. That's certainly a type of confession. Delinquents and experts. The motivations and effects it is expected to produce have varied, as have the forms it has taken. Interrogations, consultations, autobiographical narratives, we talked about those, letters. They have been recorded, transcribed, assembled into dossiers, published and commented on. It is no longer a question simply of saying what was done, the sexual act, and how it was done, but of reconstructing in and around the act the thoughts that recapitulated it, the obsessions that accompanied it, the images, desired modulations, and quality of the pleasure that animated it. For the first time, no doubt, a society has taken upon itself to solicit and hear the imparting of individual pleasures. Okay. Then he goes on, a dissemination occurred of procedures of confession. Very good. So in the next few pages, Foucault describes how what used to be a discourse connected, as he says there, 64, a discourse connected with sin and salvation has become a discourse of science. So it's in particular, I think that's something which he doesn't make explicit, really. What is he describing here in these next few pages? He's really describing the practice of modern psychology and in particular psychoanalysis, Freud. That's I think what he has in mind here when he describes how the various aspects of confession in contemporary medicine. Psychoanalysis, which is this medical practice, which relies on the assumption that speaking about oneself in the presence of a psychoanalyst itself leads to a kind of cure. It's sometimes called the talking cure. I have a certain obsession, I have a certain anxiety, I have a certain blockage that troubles me in my life. I go to the psychoanalyst. By the way, the psychoanalyst is not really a counselor. Go to the psychoanalyst in order to tell this person, associate to this person anxieties, depressions, dreams, fears, etc., etc. And most of the time the psychoanalyst will simply listen to me, not so much interpreting, but listening, eliciting further confessions, helping me to dig deeper and deeper into my psyche so that finally I get to the bottom of what gives me this anxiety, what gives me this fear, what prevents me from leading my life as fully as I would like to, etc. That's really, and that, as you can see, that has the structure of a confession. That's really what Foucault has in mind in the next few pages. Okay, so how does confession come to be a scientific practice in modern medicine? He says, well, it has 5 aspects, okay, in this context of modern medicine, in particular psychoanalysis. First, he says there is a clinical codification of the inducement to speak. Clinical codification. So the inducement to speak becomes something like itself part of a medical treatment. Lie down there, tell me about yourself, tell me about your dreams, etc. That's what he means by clinical codification of the inducement to speak. Through the postulate of a general and diffuse causality. General and diffuse causality. My problem may be that I'm afraid of entering an elevator. That we can get to the bottom of that only if we go through my entire life, basically. Okay, general and diffuse causality. In particular, of course, but again, we have to bring this to bear on sex. If I have some kind of sexual problem, how are we going to find out what the bottom of this is? How it can be resolved? Well, not only by talking about sex, by talking about this kind of causal web that holds my entire life together. Okay, through the principle of a latency intrinsic to sexuality. So there is a lot that's going to be hidden, that's going to be repressed, that has to be brought out. Fourth, through the method of interpretation. So what does this dream mean that I had yesterday, which seems completely unconnected, let's say, with sex? Well, the psychoanalyst may be able to tell me and relate the dream to something that is in fact a sexual problem. Okay? And fifth, through the medicalization of the effects of confession. Well, I already referred to that a little bit earlier on. Psychoanalysis is often sometimes referred to as the talking cure. Medicalization of the effects of confession. I tell the psychoanalyst about my troubles through the method that we just went through, these 5 points. I dig deeper and deeper and finally unearth what's really wrong with me, and I say it out. And this saying out of that first encounter, which was scary, which blocked me in some way. Saying it out, that's the cure. That's what he means by the medicalization of the effects of confession. See, psychoanalysis is different from psychiatry. In psychiatry, if somebody has a mental problem, the psychiatrist would typically prescribe a pill, thinking that it has a biological cause. The psychoanalyst will not prescribe a pill at all. The psychoanalyst will talk. And the idea is that the talking itself is the cure. Okay. Now 68. Interesting. He talks about sexuality. The book is called The History of Sexuality. Sexuality, he talks about sexuality the whole book, okay? But he talks about here, in particular, the term sexuality. He says sexuality is the correlative of that slowly developed discursive practice which constitutes the scientia sexualis. A few lectures ago, I made the remark, shared the remark with you, which is in some sense very trivial, obvious, but nonetheless contains an important insight. The remark is how interesting that the Greeks didn't have a word for sexuality. I mean, surely they were sexual beings. How interesting that in the Latin language the word sexualitas does not exist. Perhaps it exists in like 21st century Latin. It has been invented retrospectively in order to talk about this modern thing. In classical Latin, medieval Latin, there is no sexualitas. If you go to, now I'm going to say something of which I have no real knowledge, would be interesting. Some of you may know Irish, I mean traditional Irish. Irish that would have been spoken in the Middle Ages. There would be, I can tell you, without knowing this, the language, I can tell you with 100% certainty there would be no word for sexuality. And again, now you can't infer from this that people weren't having sex. That would be completely silly. So what is it about this word that we take for granted? Our sexuality. My sexuality is such and such. Well, Foucault says here, that's a very particular way of framing this aspect of human existence, this aspect that we are sexed beings, etc. It's a particular way of framing it through this scientia sexualis, through this idea according to which sexuality is an important part of our personality that makes us who we are, requires confession, requires our talking about it, etc. That's sexuality. which is something that the Greeks didn't do, the Romans didn't do, the medieval Irish didn't do, etc., etc. So it's interesting. Sexuality, if you want to shock your friends, if your friends are interested in philosophy, you can say, well, sexuality didn't exist in the 15th century or something. And you would say, wow, that's completely ridiculous. And then you can explain what this means, what this actually means. And, I think Foucault's right here. So, at any rate, next few pages, where am I now? Well, I'm on pages, really towards the end of the chapter now, where Foucault talks again about, if you look at, let's say on page, if you look at page 70, towards the center of the page there, he says, Scientia sexualis versus ars erotica, no doubt. So in these last few pages, he points out that for us meaning people in Western civilization, this scientia sexualis, this medicalized scientific discourse regarding sexuality, this discourse which is constituted by means of confession, takes the place of what in Eastern civilization is the ars erotica. So we derive, his claim is, it's interesting, our sexual pleasure, now this can't be completely true, but we derive to a large extent, let's say, our sexual pleasure from this discourse, from this establishing of knowledge regarding sexuality, whereas in the Far East the emphasis is not on knowing about sex, talking about sex, but having it, enacting it, in order to arrive at a certain mastery of the body and through that at some kind of higher knowledge. So it's a different dynamic, according to Foucault. So to summarize what I just tried to explain, 71 towards the bottom of the page, must we conclude that our scientia sexualis is but an extraordinarily subtle form of ars erotica, and that it is the Western sublimated version of that seemingly lost tradition? We don't have an ars erotica, but we talk a lot about sex. We want to gain knowledge regarding ourselves through that talk. Is that our erotic art? Is that our equivalent of this Far Eastern practice? We're at the end now. No, not at the end of the whole book, but at the end of this part. Quick summary in Foucault's own words. 72. In any case, the hypothesis of a power of repression exerted by our society on sex for economic reasons appears to be quite inadequate. Well, that's what he's been arguing, hasn't he, since the very beginning of the book. If we are to explain this whole series of reinforcements and intensifications that our preliminary inquiry has discovered. A proliferation of discourses, point 1, carefully tailored to the requirements of power. 2, the solidification of the sexual mosaic and the construction of devices capable not only of isolating it, but of stimulating and provoking it, of forming it into focuses of attention, discourses and pleasure. And thirdly, the mandatory production of confessions and the subsequent establishment of a system of legitimate knowledge and of an economy of manifold pleasures. So this paragraph, it's not a whole paragraph, this portion of a paragraph that I just read to you summarizes the content of the book so far. All right, so much for today's lecture. As always, thank you for your attention. I hope you're all doing okay. Despite the difficult circumstances. I think some of you are a little bit stressed. Sorry about that. The good news, perhaps, is that there's not going to be a lecture on Friday, since it's Good Friday, and then we have the Easter break. So you're not going to hear from me at least through video, for a while now. In other words, nothing for you that you have to watch, no knowledge that you have to absorb. There's a little bit of a break. You may have to work on other things. Of course, if you want to contact me about the subject, about the content of the lectures, the best way would be to post on Moodle, so that we can actually have a discussion involving other people. If you want to contact me with particular questions regarding, let's say, your essays or individual concerns that you have, feel free to email me. Okay. All the best now. Bye-bye.